I told you that we would be done with cost allocation after we talked about activity-based costing. Remember, there were three different ways to allocate, or three different aspects that you allocate on. The last two of which were volume-based versus activity-based costing, and only those two choices. Well, we have one more chapter to talk about cost allocation, and we'll talk about two components or two different completely separate aspects of cost allocation. Departmental allocation, which frankly is very relevant in the real world for every company. And then we'll talk about joint products, which if you're in the oil industry, you might want to listen more carefully, because it's definitely a joint product kind of industry where you start off with crude oil, and it's crude oil until it's refined, then it becomes 4 or 5 different products. And how do you allocate the costs? So those are the two main categories. They are very much unrelated to each other, except they both use math. Now we're going to go through some math. How many of you like math? Oh, good. How many of you don't? Bad. I like math. We'll talk about cost allocation with service departments, and then we'll talk about 3 different ways that you can allocate from service department to production department, which is where you want them to end up. You want those costs to end up. And there are some very, very important ethical challenges with cost allocation in general, and in particular from service department. I think this is going to be relevant for some of your companies. I know it will be, actually. And then we'll talk about joint products. How many of you have come from some kind of a shared service department, worked in a shared service department sometime in the past? Shared service departments are payroll, HR, IT, accounting. These are departments, generally, it's a single department that provides services to everyone else in the organization, including, and this is the challenge, services to each other. The IT department needs HR services. The HR department needs IT services. They have computers. And so that's what muddies up this allocation process. The fact that you need to allocate among service departments before you get them out to the production department as well. Now, you don't need to centralize these services. You don't need to have shared services. But most companies do. And you do because you save money, you improve quality, you reduce risk. You know, if you had every department doing their own IT with no controls, you're taking on quite a bit of risk. If every department doing their own payroll or HR, costs would be astronomical. So that's why you centralize those businesses. And I talked about these before. If you chose not to do it, you could decentralize it. You could have every department clearly. Well, I'll give my Goldman Sachs example. When I first went to Goldman Sachs, I was in IT, and they were a trailer in the IT world. Surprising, it's late 80s. They were trailing. They were not as good as some other companies. They had just had this disaster where their mainframe data centers were flooded. It was just a disaster and set them back terribly and brought in a very strong, centralized person to lead IT, made him a partner. And in those days, it was unheard of to have a partner in IT. And he brought in a bunch of people, including me, and a very strong, centralized control of the IT function to get it from disaster to working. Once it was working and it was good, he became extendable. Because really, what Goldman Sachs is good at is, well, they were good at it, be careful, responding to customers, responding to the markets, being quick, and centralized control doesn't work well with quick and responsive. And so they swung all the way other direction with their IT and kind of decentralized everything. And part of that as well. So decentralizing IT is possible. You can't decentralize all of IT, but there are components of IT that you can decentralize. That's an option where it's more responsive in inefficiency associated with that responsiveness, and there's also risk. Everyone's doing their own technology, and they're not having the proper controls over it. Some significant risk. Another way to implement shared services is to outsource. IT again, HR, call centers are outsourced overseas. And I talked about utilities, same idea. So if you think about financial services, the operations area is an area that's not usually considered a competitive advantage area. And so to the extent that you could use a third party and create a third party to take care of it, that would be great. So you have these shared services departments, and you need to get those costs out to the products in some way. But you want to do it in a way that everybody feels as though they're getting their allocation fairly. Because if you allocate unfairly, and you reward your managers based upon allocations that are done unfairly, it does not create effective decision making. And so you want some kind of cause and effect relationship in your allocation. If you use a resource, you pay for that resource, essentially. If you use HR, you pay for HR in the appropriate amount. Same thing for IT. So you want to have a cause and effect relationship between the service department's allocation and the end users. And so we talked about volume-based and activity-based. I said that was it. Departmental is really an enhancement on volume-based. It's somewhere between these two, but it's really a volume-based approach. But rather than going directly from the cost to the product, it goes from overhead to a production department, and then from the production department to the product. And this picture kind of summarizes that, but leaves out a couple of lines. So you have overhead costs. Direct costs go directly into each of your departments, whether they're service or production. Indirect costs are allocated into each of these departments in some fashion. And then from these departments, they need to end up in your production departments. So these shared services departments need to somehow allocate into production. You could say that there are lines here between the shared services departments as well. They need to allocate to each other. And then from these production departments, the final allocation is the product center. So as we said, the challenge is that service departments service each other. And that's the challenge. Otherwise, this would be a relatively simple thing to do. And so there are three methods used to allocate. It's actually a four, which is kind of heuristics. companies end up doing. Everyone know what heuristic means? Heuristic just means, you know, it's kind of rule of thumb. You kind of, it's not scientific, but you get kind of close to the right answer. And the cost of doing it perfectly isn't worth the incremental cost. So you use historical bases in some way and do it heuristically. So you have the direct method, the step method, and the reciprocal method. In increasing complexity. What would cost and management time be? We have to go through a mathematical example. Okay, Beery Company. Beery Company has two production departments, assembly and painting. And from now on, after this point, we'll call it P1 and P2. And two service departments, HR and IT. We'll call it, from now on, S1 and S2. Okay? And they use direct labor hours to allocate indirect costs and machine indirect labor costs and machine hours to allocate indirect materials costs. Kind of simplified example. First, there are direct costs. So each one of these departments, both production and service, have direct costs associated with them, labor and machine hours. Actually, these are in hours, and then these are the costs associated with those hours, excuse me. So this is 1,800 hours, 320 hours, total costs on this line. And the total amount is 36,000. This is in thousands. So it's 36,000 there. Then there are indirect costs, both labor and materials. You can't trace them. $25,000 and $5,000, and you don't know how to allocate them among these four departments, and ultimately these two departments, and ultimately two products. Okay? But you do have some more information that you use. They figured out how much the various other departments use of the service department's resources. So service department 1 was HR, I think. The IT department uses 40% of HR, and each of the production departments use 30%. HR uses 10% of IT, and each of the production departments, production 1 uses 30, and production 2 uses 60. So this is how much of this, and these are both, each one of these lines adds up to 100, as you can imagine. And now for later analysis, how are the production department's resources used to create product? So this is the allocation from the production department's two specific products. So production 1 is based upon direct labor hours and it's 50-50. And production 2 is based upon machine hours, it's 25-75 for the two products. Okay? So this is background information. We'll come back to it. Okay, and the first step is to figure some things out here. We were given the direct labor hours used by every one of the four departments, and we were given the machine hours used by every one of the four departments. From that, we have the total, and we can calculate the percentage of the total. Now, why do we need this percentage of the total? No one remember why? Because we're using direct
allocate indirect
to allocate the overhead, the indirect. So it's being allocated based upon direct labor and machine hours. You need these percentages to figure out where they should go. Exactly. So we're now going to get the costs into the 4 departments. Step 1, get the full cost into all 4 departments, service and production. We're given this, the direct costs. The indirect costs, we were given 25,000 and 5,000, and we just calculated these percentages, as Igor said. So our indirect labor is allocated based upon 15% of the total 25,000. So it's here, 10% here, etc. And then for indirect materials, there's a total 5,000 costs allocated by 10%, 5%, 35%. So the indirect costs are allocated to the departments, and you can figure out the total cost of each department by adding the direct costs plus their allocated indirect costs. So we now have total costs residing in each department. And that's what you do in your first step of service department allocation. And this analysis is the same no matter what model you use. So step 1 is always the same. Get the costs into their appropriate department. Doesn't matter whether it's service or production. Now we go into the second and third phases, which differ depending upon the methods. First, we'll do the direct method, the easiest way to do it. Okay? The direct method essentially says, let's forget about the service department allocating to each other. Let's ignore it, throw it away. And that's all we're doing. So if you go back here, not back here, excuse me. Go back here. You see that service department goes 40%, 30%, and 30%. So if you forget about this 40%, it's just allocating half to Department 1 and half to Department 2, right? Because you're just ignoring that. So that's really, you could think of this as 50-50. It's going half to each department. Service Department 2, ignore that 10%, 30 and 60, it's really 1/3, 2/3, 33% and 67%. Okay? So you ignore, in the direct method, the inter-service department allocation, which is what we've done here. So you take the costs, that the total cost from phase 1 of 5850, and just divide it half and half between the 2 production departments from service department 1, and divide it 2/3, well, 1/3, 2/3 from service department 2, and you add that to the direct costs that went into each department. And you now have total costs for each of your 2 production departments, ignoring the inter-department allocations. Okay? This was your total cost. You now have them in your production departments. That's the completion of phase 2. Now, phase 3 is the same for all 3 examples, but you'll be using different numbers. So phase 3 is to get it from the production departments, the cost from the production departments to the product. Backwards here. And we have percentages to do that. We know the labor hours from labor hours were 50/50. Machine hours were 25/75. And Production Department 1 went by labor hours, and Production Department 2 went by machine hours. That was a simplified example. And so we simply took the ratios and took the total cost that we just figured out and allocated it 50/50 here, 25/75 there. And you now have the costs for each product, 24,000 and 42,000. Okay? Direct method. What do we think? Following it? Reasonably well? Gotta do it, I know. You'll have a chance. You have to do these so you can get a good feel for it.
Professor?
Yes.
So I just don't know why we ignored the inter-service allocation. So the cost will be under excellence, right?
Well, we didn't completely ignore it. We ignored it from the perspective of caring about it, but it won't be underestimated because by changing this 30% to 50%, we're actually allocating all of the costs, but we're maybe not allocating it correctly. So we're not under-allocating, but we are potentially misallocating. Okay? This first approach is the roughest approach. Okay? We get all the costs allocated out, but maybe not in the proper ratios. Any other questions? We're going to go to the step method next. The step method says, rather than ignoring completely the allocations, let's choose. Question or stretching? Let's just choose one of the service departments to allocate to the other. Rather than having this guesswork between them, let's just choose one to allocate to the other, and then ignore the allocation back. Get all the costs out of one service department into the second service department. Then from that second service department, everywhere. And when I say get it out of one to the other, it's out of from service department 1 to service department 2 plus the production departments. So we'll get rid of service department 1, and then we'll get rid of service department 2. Now we only have 2 service departments here. This gets pretty hairy when there are 10 service departments. As you choose the steps. Right? This is a simplified example. So, and the way you choose which one to allocate out first is the one that's getting less from the other one. So since service department 2 is getting 40% of service department 1, we want to do this allocation. We don't want to do it with 10%. It's less important. So we know that we allocated service department 1, if you go back to the given information, 40%, 30%, and 30%. And we knew that there were 50 total costs in service department 1. So you just divide it up among the 3 other departments. 5, 40, 30, 30. Now, we also knew from phase 1 that there was 8250 in service department 2. But really, service department 2 is at 8250 plus what was just allocated into it from service department 1. It's 2340. So those 2 numbers together are this 10,590. It's what was originally allocated plus the allocation from Department 1. And now we have to get that into the production departments. we use the 1/3, 2/3. One-third, 2/3. So for this amount, the new amount, which is its original allocation plus service department, one's allocation to it. And so this is 1/3, 2/3. And you add to that the original costs for each of the production departments. And so service department 2 allocation plus the original gets 30,000 and 36,000. So again, you've allocated everything. You have 66,000 in total cost. You haven't lost anything. A different number. I forget what the first one was. 24, 30. Or 30,000, 36,000. Almost exactly the same. Not much difference. It's 10,500. Okay, good. Thank you for asking. Let's start with this 8,250. Okay. Let's not start with that 8,000. Let's start with it from a different page. Let's start with this 8,250 right here. This was at the very beginning, in phase 1 of your analysis. You determined that the total costs associated with service department 2 was its direct costs plus its allocation of indirect costs. That was 8,250. You determined service department 1 was 5,850. Okay, remember these two numbers now. Do you understand where these came from? Okay. Understand where these two numbers came from. So you have this 8,020, and you have that 5,800. So the first step was to allocate service department 1. You have to allocate out this 5,850 to the other 3 departments at 40, 30, 30. So you 2,340 went to service department 2. So the original 8,250 plus 2,340, which is that was service department 2's original allocation, and this is service department 1 going to service department 2. Okay. 10,590. Okay. And then you have to allocate that 10,590. Any other questions to get here? What are you laughing at?
It's fun.
Wait till you do the next one.
I can't wait.
And now you do the third phase exactly the same way we did last time. We have to allocate out from the production departments to the products. And we have an allocation. Obviously, it's going to be very similar to the first example with the direct method because we had very similar allocations. These numbers were very similar to the direct method. Okay, that's 2 of the 3 models. We get to do the third model. How many of you were engineers undergrad? There we go. Industrial? How many of you have heard of linear programming? How many of you have done linear programming? did it yesterday? Oh, okay. Okay, so when I was an undergraduate many years ago, I went to Cornell, and I was an animal science teacher. We all go through different stages. I thought I wanted to be a veterinarian. I thought I wanted to be a veterinarian. Right now, I'm figuring it out. And, you know, I went for 2 years, and I was focused on being a veterinarian. I realized that was who I was. And I took a course in animal nutrition. And this is true. When you feed a cow, you don't really care what it tastes like, right? You care about maximizing the nutrition and minimizing the cost. Right? And it's got to taste at least okay to the cow. And you want to make sure that what you feed them isn't going to kill the cow. Like, sadly, one of the great sources of protein is not other cows. Worse than that. Worse than that. It's uric acid. Where does uric acid come from? Urea. Where does urea come from? Bird. But if you put too much of that into the feed mixture, you kill the cow. And you need to know other things like the amount of phosphorus versus, this is a long time ago, phosphorus versus calcium has to be 2 to 1 or 1 to 2, whatever. There are certain ratios in nutrition you have to keep in order to keep all healthy. So there are a lot of stuff that you have to bring together to put together the proper feed formulation, and at the end of the day, not kill the cow and cost as little money as possible. During the Second World War, they did the same kind of things with humans, because there was rationing, and so they used linear programming to figure out, what you could eat and what you need to eat to get enough nutrition at the least possible cost. So, I don't know if they had to get food stamps or whatever you had to get your food. So, but anyway, I took that course, and I realized that's what I really enjoyed. So we shifted. That's why I'm here today. Yes.
I have a question about phase 2, the step method.
Sure.
Can I go back to it?
We're on it.
No. How do you decide to allocate S1 to S2, or why not the S2 to S1? It is an answer.
It is a decision that you make, and the best heuristic decision in this case was because S1 was going 40% to S2,
okay,
and S2 was only going 10% to S1. It was more. This was a more important allocation to keep and not ignore. You're ignoring one of the two, so you ignore the one that's lesser.
So when the S1 is 50 and the S2 is 50,
Then you choose. You would choose.
So if we allocate the S2 S1 first in this question, do we get the same answer?
I don't know. You want to do it?
No, I don't understand.
That's your homework tonight.
Okay.
I haven't done it. You would probably get it. You would get a different answer. The answer is you get a different answer. Whether it's materially different, you have to do the work to understand. I don't know.
Okay.
So anyway, I tell this story only because the third method is linear programming, right? At the end of the day. Now, it's called the reciprocal method. Now, you did it in algebra, and you can do it in algebra here, because there are only, it's really not truly linear programming. You can do it in algebra here because we only have 2 service departments. But if you had 10 simultaneous equations, I guess you could do it. But the point is, if you use simultaneous equations, which is kind of simpler than linear programming, actually. It's not a minimization of system qualities. As long as you have enough equations, you have the same number of equations that have variables, you can do it. You just create simultaneous equations, and you work from there. So this is going to give you the most exact answer. It just gets very mathematically cumbersome when you think about having lots and lots of service departments. So essentially, your total cost for service department 1 is the cost that was allocated to it originally, plus its allocation from service department 2. The total cost for service department 2 is the amount that was allocated to it originally, plus its allocation from service department 1. Now, obviously, you don't have these two answers yet. We have two equations with two variables. So you could do simultaneous equations, algebra. Simplistic. The easiest way to do it is substitution, so you have one equation, one variable. Everybody remember this from 11th grade, 10th grade? So you just take this 40% plus S1, put it in here, and you solve. And we did this math. Do it again. 6,900 and 11,000. So service department 1's total cost is 6,900. Service department 2's total cost is 11,000. And now we use these numbers going forward. Where we would have used 5850 and 8250, we'll now use 6953 and 1131. Now, the most important thing to see with this model is we didn't up this to 50-50 and 1/3, 2/3, right? Why not? Can somebody in words tell me why we didn't do that?
Because, like, I mean, some of it has been allocated to other service departments. So, service 1, service 2, and
Not some of it, all of it. All of it has been allocated. The amount the 6953 is all of it. It includes that 40%.
Yeah.
So you're not losing it, you just handled it already. And similarly, you just handled it for the 10%. Okay? So you keep 30-30 and 30-60, and you do your allocation, and it's almost exactly the same anyway. 3 models, not dramatically different. Which way would you use, given a choice? Like reciprocal, but you have more than 2. I mean, it's all math, but I guess we have more than 2 departments. The calculator. Trust me when I tell you, in the real world, it's a give and take. It's an argument. This is one of the great areas of corporate arguing. You know, I don't want so much of that IT budget. I don't use it that much. I don't want so much HR. I don't use it that much. And it's a great area of corporate arguments. Absolutely. You do it each time, and then, you know, whatever department it is says, I don't want so much of IT. We don't like them. We don't use them. They're cost center. You know, they're overhead. And then they always think they're getting allocated too much for whatever service department. And so it's an argument every year. Unless it's a good year, then no one argues quite as much. But in a bad year, it's a big area. Okay, so that's the reciprocal method. And then, just as you did in the other cases, you go from the production departments to the products, and you split hairs and you figure out how to allocate